everyone.
Hello, my name is Kozlik, and I'm here today with,
Jonathan Dekhtyar.
and we are going to be looking into ALS, which is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. So let's jump into it. So first, to understand ALS, we have to know that it's a neurodegenerative disease that mainly affects the nerve cells, which are neurons, which control muscle movement. This is characterized by the deterioration and loss of both upper and lower motor neurons. So that means our neurons are cells and they die in the disease of ALS. So ALS is one of the most common causes of motor neuron lesion. And the illness follows a consistently advancing trajectory, and in majority of its instances results in the mortality of patients within 3 to 5 years from the onset of initial clinical symptoms. So there are ways to slow down the advancement of ALS, but there's no way to completely cure it, and patients do die relatively quickly. ALS is considered a multi-factor disease with a complex of genetic and environmental factors involved in its development. Mainly ALS is received through genetics, but there have been few instances where environmental factors have been seen to cause ALS within patients. So the impact of this disease is the gradual loss of voluntary muscle control and neurotoxic manifestations. And this can often lead to paralysis. So the neuron stops sending signals and the muscles weaken. So you can no longer control your muscles and you become paralyzed. About 5,000 new patients are diagnosed with ALS every year, and they die relatively quickly. So there's about 30,000 people at a time in the United States who have ALS. So the molecular mechanism, so how it works is that in the neural cell body, there are different proteins that can aggregate and become toxic to the cells in several ways. So the abnormal protein aggregates, these are from genes TDP32, SOD1, and FUS in the cytoplasm motor neurons. The gene sequencing coding for these protons is changed, so they have changed structure and changed function. The proteins begin to misfold due to the change in these genetics, and so their three-dimensional shape, also known as their tertiary and quaternary structure, is altered. These misfolded proteins stick to one another and they begin to accumulate, leading to aggregates known as inclusion bodies. You could see that in the picture, those yellow and pink clumps, those are the inclusion bodies of the misfolded protons seen in yellow and the properly folded proteins seen in pink. So these inclusion bodies accumulate in the cytoplasm of motor neurons and become toxic to cells and induce motor neuron death. So the different proteins can aggregate and become toxic to cells in several ways. For example, they could damage mitochondrial cell power generators. Mitochondrial cell power generators, the mitochondria is the cell power generators, and damage to their DNA from oxidative stress can trigger motor neuron cell death. Also, ALS is seen to affect DNA repair processes. When DNA breaks, the repair processes usually help assemble it back together. But without these repair processes, the DNA is altered, and this also contributes to the affiliation with the disease. So then later, there's also damage to the transporting functions of the cell. So the Golgi apparatus, along with the, sorry, one second, we lost the slide. Just next slide. So the Golgi apparatus, along with the extracellular reticulum, it can no longer transfer the proteins and neurotransmitters through the cell. So this affects cell signaling both in the cytoplasm and in the neuron axon. And then damage to the cytoplasm causes cells to retract from the muscles, and the neurons can no longer connect to the muscle and nearby and signal the muscle to contract. This is what causes the weakness in muscle. Then additionally, there's oligodendrocytes, which produce myelin. They're special cells that produce myelin that cover the axon, and they stop working, which also ultimately leads to neuron cell death. And then astrocytes have a reduced uptake of neurotransmitters, This causes overactivation of the receptors on the synapses, and this overactivation also all leads to the death of the motor cell. Once the motor cell is dead, then we can no longer control our muscle function.
So the doses and the effects. So we understand that the brain sends information to the muscles through motor neurons, which help regulate the voluntary muscle contractions. The loss of muscle control results from the degeneration and the death of the motor neurons brought on by advanced ALS. A couple of the symptoms of ALS include skeletal muscle atrophy, motor cortex atrophy, corticospinal and corticobulbar tract sclerosis, the thinning of the CN7, fasciculations, which is twitchiness, muscle weakness, and muscle cramping. Progression of ALS starts in one region of the body and then spreads to the other areas. Rate of progression varies from person to person. The effects on the motor neurons include that the fact that these neurons just degenerate and they die. This leads to the loss of communication between the brain and muscles. The muscles that motor neurons regulate shrink and weaken as they die, and this may lead to issues with basic daily activities such as movement and coordination. So we basically understand that without these motor neurons, everything in our body just slowly starts to begin to deteriorate, and that's why people with ALS have a short lifespan and they die relatively quickly. Another thing is respiratory complications. So breathing muscles may be impacted by ALS, which could result in respiratory issues. People may have trouble breathing and suffer shortness of breath as the respiratory muscles deteriorate. The cognitive and behavioral changes, even though ALS primarily affects the motor neurons, individuals may have problems with language, emotional control, and executive function are possible changes. As you guys see on the image on the left, you could see how there's 4 different stages of ALS. So we see the ALS, the early stage, just the trouble of putting on clothes. Your muscles start twitching and cramping a little bit more. Once you begin to get towards the middle age, muscles might become paralyzed. You might need a wheelchair or a walker, inability to drive, and breathing problems might occur. The late stages, mobility is extremely limited. You're basically confined to a wheelchair at this point, and the breathing function becomes severely impaired. End stage ALS is basically you're on your deathbed and paralysis of the voluntary muscles. There's a lot more respiratory complications, and that's what usually is the most common cause of death. And hospice care may be necessary at this stage. So the neurotoxic manifestation. Although ALS is mostly thought to be a motor neuron disease, other neurotoxic symptoms are becoming more well recognized, especially in some subtypes of the illness. An example of this is frontotemporal lobar degeneration, and that's just the dementia and the motor neuron degeneration are 2 characteristics of the ALS FTD subtype. FTD causes alterations in behavior, personality, and language by affecting the frontal and temporal lobes of the brain. Executive dysfunction, linguistic issues like aphasia, and behavioral abnormalities like apathy and disinhibition are examples of cognitive symptoms. Executive dysfunction refers to problems involving cognitive functions like organizing, planning, starting tasks, and making decisions. Psychiatric some symptoms, anxiety and depression are among the psychological symptoms that people with ALS may encounter. This disease's physical and physiological difficulties may cause these symptoms. And as you guys see in this image on the bottom right, we see how on the frontal temporal dementia, and you see the frontal cortex, you see that's where usually our personality is stored. So the personality change, the language dysfunction, the memory impairment, all of that is severely impacted when people have ALS. Another thing is altered emotion processing. People with ALS may have emotional lability or abrupt changes in mood or changes in how they express their emotions. ALS can affect how people process their emotions. Another thing is cognitive impairment, difficulties with memory, attention, and other cognitive functions. It is also very important to understand that the exact mechanisms underlying these neurotoxic manifestations are not fully understood as of yet, and research in this area is ongoing. Preventative therapeutic strategies. It is even more difficult to prevent ALS when the etiology is unknown. While it is widely acknowledged that ALS is caused by a combination of genetic predisposition, aging, and cumulative environmental exposure, little is known about the non-genetic factors that also play a role. A couple of strategies that physicians and scientists have began to use is something called genetic counseling. Understanding the genetic variants linked to ALS may enable early intervention or monitoring. Genetic testing could identify specific mutations associated with ALS. Another one is antioxidant and neuroprotective therapies. They believe that oxidative stress and neuroinflammation contribute to the development of ALS. The goal of neuroprotective and antioxidant tactics is to lessen neuronal damage. And another thing that caught my eye was how they began to start to use stem cell therapy. So they use stem cell therapy in order to replace the damaged motor neurons or provide neuroprotective effects. Uh, Stem cell therapy is still in the experimental stage, which means more research needs to be conducted to understand the safety and efficiency of it. Another thing that physicians have encountered is two medications that are FDA approved, and they are called Riluzole and Edaravone. And these two medications can slow the progression of disease, yet can't fully prevent an individual from developing ALS. That is where researchers and scientists are still trying to discover a medication that could fully stop this neurodegenerative disease. But at least these two medications that are FDA approved can slow the progression and give doctors and physicians a little bit more time to decide on the next steps with these patients. Um, Another thing is the lifestyle factors. So certain lifestyle factors may influence the risk of developing ALS on an individual. Examples of these include exposure to environmental toxins, diet, and physical activity. It is extremely important, as all doctors say, to maintain a healthy lifestyle with a balanced diet and regular exercise. These things go a long way, especially as people begin to go into their later ages of their life. Uh, okay.
So this brings us to our conclusion. As we mentioned before, ALS is a neurodegenerative disease that weakens muscles and impairs physical function through the death of motor neurons. So the way that happens is the accumulation of proteins in the cytoplasm of these motor neurons. They're toxic to the mitochondria, myelin sheath transport systems within the cell and astrocytes. This all stops signaling between cells and doesn't allow cells to function properly. So as you can see on the right, that would be on top would be a normal nerve cell where the axon and the dendrites on the bottom are connected to the muscle cell, and this creates a healthy muscle cell, versus when they can no longer attach, this creates a wasted muscle cell and you no longer have control of your muscles. So although medication and therapy can slow the progression of ALS and its symptoms, ALS is not curable, and that is something that is still a big deal in the healthcare field. Thank you for listening to our talk. These are
Thank
our
you.
references, and we hope you enjoyed.